booster rollout too slow is the headline on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. So I heard this morning a government minister, Anne Trevelyan, who I think is the vaccines minister, I'm not really sure, it's hard to keep up, basically talking about how well things are going, but unfortunately people aren't getting their boosters fast enough because there is a mood abroad that if you don't get the third one, then you're going to get COVID, which shouldn't worry you if you've got the 2 vaccines, right? Also, they're saying, and of course, children are getting it now as well. Well, they're not actually, because that figure that I think that you quoted last week, 11% of 12 to 15-year-olds, is still the same. It hasn't gone up because people just don't want to do it, right?
I think that figure will go up, though, once they have the walk-in centres, because some people haven't been vaccinated because it's just simply not happened in their school yet because of the logistics of the rollout. But I still don't think it's going to go too high. Probably won't go higher than Scotland, which was about 36% last week.
Yes, that is much higher, isn't it?
And
do you think because they've got those outside centres?
they've got mass walk-in centres as well outside school. Some kids don't want to be vaccinated in school, and logistically it's not rolled out yet. I think the thing with the booster, let's see what happens. Obviously it's going to make sense for some people because we've seen the efficacy of the vaccine be knocked down percentage point by percentage point. And now they're saying, it does wane, and so you need a booster. But I was talking to somebody this week who felt really ill after their vaccines and doesn't want the booster because they didn't have a good experience. I think there's also some concern about vaccine passports and thinking, well, what am I going to just have to keep doing this forever?
Well, exactly, because if they're going to argue that, well, of course, the vaccine wears off, so you have to get a new one every so often. Well, how often is that going to be, and how long is it going to be for? Because we don't get told that. When Vaughan Gethin was on last week from Wales with Julia, and she said to him, how long are you going to be doing all this for? He couldn't tell her. He said, well, we don't know. It would be wrong to make a deadline which we would then have to break. And it's like, well, why would it be wrong? Why can't you make a deadline and make it conditional upon see how it goes?
Well, what would be right is to say to people, here's the booster if you want it, then let them have it if they want it, and not tie it to a mandatory vaccine passport. Just leave it to people's individual responsibility and choice and informed consent.
Yes, I think absolutely right. And you want to talk about that informed consent because the Coronavirus Emergency Powers Act runs out, doesn't it? I'm not quite sure how it works. Does it run out today and then they vote it back in?
There's a sunset clause so that most of the provisions in the Coronavirus Act expire March 2022.
Right.
But there's a vote every 6 months. So what's happening today is that MPs will vote on the motion as it is. They don't get to quibble or debate. They don't get to say, let's keep this bit, let's let go of that bit.
Right.
The government presents, this is what you vote on, and MPs vote. I think it will go through, and there's a few reasons. First of all, the worst schedules have been dropped. So, the most criticised powers aren't in it anymore. That's schedules 16, 21 and 22.
Okay.
So 16 is the power to direct the temporary closure of schools.
Right.
21...
So that's gone?
It won't. It shouldn't be in what's being voted on today,
okay.
no.
Right.
Although, all right, let's talk about that. That's not how schools were closed. We all know schools were closed, right? Yeah, they shut, didn't they?
They certainly did.
But they didn't quite shut because they were open for the children of key workers and certain types of children who might have,
might be
like
vulnerable.
Vulnerable. And so what happened, if you remember the Simon Dolan court case last spring in May 2021, the government said, oh no, schools haven't closed. That was merely advice, which they followed.
Yes.
So the government managed to close schools without actually legally directing the closure of schools. So it's good to see Schedule 61 go. The fact is it's not needed, to be honest, in order for the government to close schools.
So they could still shut them without that anyway.
Through some kind of sleight of hand.
Yes.
And actually what we've got happening at the moment is that children, for instance, we'll come on to the testing. Let's come on to the testing in schools a bit more. The other schedule that's going is Schedule 21, and that is the one that allowed individuals to be detained if they were potentially infectious, and also your children to be detained. So when this was drafted last spring, I might sound a bit extreme, but I actually had a big cry when I read it, because I thought, how can this be happening in the country that we live in? The idea was if you were potentially infectious, which at the time could have been anybody with a little cough, there was the power to detain you or your children and forcibly treat you and quarantine you. So that's gone, which is great. That was an unsettling schedule.
Why would you even put that in there, though? I mean, that would be my question. What on earth would make you want to do something like that? I don't know if you saw the piece of the weekend, which was written by Matthew Said about a guy called Mark Warner. Did you see that?
I've written about it. I wrote a little rebuttal piece the same day.
Oh, right. Okay, good.
Yes.
Well, so let's talk about that, because I see this guy as being part of something much bigger, and we didn't know about him. Now, you may have done because you were delving deeper into this maybe than a lot of people were, but I certainly never heard of this guy before. And to see somebody like that being waltzed into Downing Street, into the heart of government, to sit down with the Prime Minister, to convince the Prime Minister that lockdown's a good idea based on his projections of artificial intelligence, knowing nothing about medicine, knowing nothing about the physical nature of the virus, knowing nothing at all about what would actually happen. It's quite ridiculous, isn't it?
I think,
not to say frightening.
I think there was a lot that was wrong with that article and with the very notion that that's what happened. I think we're rewriting history. It's a revisionist version of history already. Worse than that, it's mythologizing the hero, the genius, as Mark Warner was called. Now this is
the cleverest guy in the room type stuff.
Yes, but in that piece, Syed says that Dominic Cummings says that Mark Warner is the most ethical man he's ever met. Well, there you go then. That's all right, isn't it? But this isn't how things work in a democratically elected country.
Right.
You don't get one genius waltzing in and imposing an experimental draconian lockdown on the country. Why weren't the epidemiologists, the doctors, the sociologists and the disaster planners in the room? That's not a decision for some little-known data scientist and the Prime Minister to make in isolation.
But this is what Dominic Cummings' mantra is, though. Dominic Cummings' mantra is, forget about the civil servants, they're worthless. Don't listen to anyone who's not really, really intelligent like me. And he's so intelligent he couldn't even keep his own job, right? And he was stitched up by Boris Johnson's wife, which is not to say that in a sexist way, but I mean, if he was that clever, how did that all happen to him?
Well, you see, you think you haven't heard of Mark Warner, but do you remember when Dominic Cummings said there was a man he wanted to be endowed with kingly authority and to run the country like a kind of dictator?
Yes.
That was Mark Warner.
Was it? Okay.
That's Mark Warner.
See, people like Dominic Cummings, also for me, have no business running government. I mean, he was a very good soldier and a very good lieutenant, or maybe even a good general for Boris Johnson in the whole Brexit campaign and getting Brexit done, and the whole Leave EU organisation and all of that, vote leave. But he should never have been in Downing Street, in my view.
Well, but also his very idea that during a crisis you want a dictator to make decisions is dangerous. Effective leadership happens in more flat, hierarchical teams where you can make decisions without judgment, where you can red team people. Shouldn't be made by a dictator. Now, Mark Warner may well be a genius data scientist, but he's not a sociologist or an epidemiologist. He couldn't have foreseen the unintended consequences of lockdown.
Right.
So it's quite a troubling piece.
Right.
So I've rebutted that. That's on my Substack.
Oh,
plug.
Well, I'll go find that and retweet it, because I have sent out the other Matthew Said piece out, so I'll have a look at that and make sure that goes on. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. I love our little digressions. Right, the other schedule, which was a very criticised and troubling one, was Schedule 22. That's going, and that gives government the right to prohibit events and gatherings. So this is great. So in theory, schools shouldn't be shut, although they can be if they want. Potentially infectious people can't be forcibly detained.
Yes.
Phewie.
Wow, that's good.
Yeah, exactly. And gatherings and events shouldn't be restricted. So I think it will be voted through because those most worrying powers have been removed. The other thing is, MPs are going to want to keep their rebellious powder dry for other votes. So I suspect MPs that really object to the Coronavirus Act will just abstain.
Yeah.
I think it will go through. Also, you mentioned the fear-mongering before. There's been a lot of fear-mongering again recently as we come into
Just
the
over
autumn.
the last few days, actually.
Prepping and priming us for probably vaccine passports and other restrictions. And of course, there was also that cross-party report, coronavirus lessons learned. Not many lessons learned in that report. It's 145 pages of opinion. Very little is evidence-based. There's still no cost-benefit analysis of lockdown. No. Its conclusion is that we should have locked down quicker. So if that's the kind of mood that's being built up, obviously they're not going to vote against the Coronavirus Act, which allows government to impose some rules, some laws under those emergency powers. But it does have this sunset clause of March 2022 anyway. The thing that we should really keep our eye on, and what it would be great to see coming out of today, the big goal should be reviewing the Public Health Act, because the Coronavirus Act was brought in under the Public Health Act. It's really the Public Health Act that's responsible for lockdown in that sense.
Yes.
So Francis Hall, the barrister who represented Simon Dolan in that case last year, has written a great piece about why we need to review the Public Health Act.
In terms of what exactly, though? In terms of the way that it's rolled out, or in terms of the new rules that have been put in, or or what exactly?
Well, so a couple of suggestions, and I'm not the legal eagle. You should get on somebody like Francis Hall to talk about this. He would be brilliant on it. I have heard him talk, and so I'm going to do a really bad job
Francis.
of rehashing some of his points. But for instance, that it could be having longer to debate whether these huge draconian laws are brought in. Perhaps they need to be voted on every 2 weeks, not every 2 years or every 6 months. For there to be stronger barriers and thresholds before something like a lockdown can be implemented. This all happened very easily. With
it did.
Just hours of debate. Yes, just hours of debate.
Because what I think they should also do, and I will take you up on that and get Francis Hall on, because Peter Hitchens and I were talking about this, because he wrote a piece at the weekend saying we've now been so conditioned to this kind of behaviour and this kind of instruction, if you like, from the government, that we're now expecting it. And so he says there may well be another lockdown, but it might have nothing to do with COVID. They might decide to lock you down for some other reason. And the people will go, oh, well, we've done this before, so we can do it again. And I think what we should now do is make the government admit that we are no longer in a state of emergency, or whatever we were in when it was, at its height, when it started in March last year, all the way through to the sort of end of May of this year. We are now in a very different place. We are, as far as I'm concerned, more or less back to normal. I know that the doom mongers will say, oh yeah, but infection rates are up and people are going to hospital more, and there's still people dying from it. Well, yeah, there's still people dying every day of all sorts of things, but that doesn't mean that we are any longer in an emergency. So they should declare that and say we are now back to normal. Anything else that we do as a draconian measure of any kind has to be single-handedly voted on one by one.
I quite agree. And just to make this really clear, although I think MPs will vote this through today, I don't think they should. I think symbolically it should go. And we're not in an emergency, and so we shouldn't be under emergency legislation. No. If there's anything, it should be primary legislation. Right. If there's a situation that needs tackling now, with where we are now, we should have primary legislation, not emergency legislation.
I was shouting at the radio this morning, as I often do coming in, because all these conversations that we're having now around the new boiler systems that we're all supposed to be putting in, heat pumps and all of this. And it's almost as though I was listening to a politician, it was a Labour guy, I think, talking about how, well, in order to achieve net zero, we must do this. And so they've invented an entire sort of end point that we must now race towards without really explaining why we have to race towards it and what it's going to do. It's not really going to do anything.
It's the problem with the enshrinement of key performance indicators, and net zero is the ultimate KPI. Net zero, zero. It's the ultimate KPI, and everyone's just like racing towards it. But all the other considerations just drop away. Well, what's that going to cost us householders? Don't forget, we should have had all those costs by COP26. We still don't have them.
Well, Boris is going to spend £450 billion of our money loaning it out to us to get a third of a heat pump.
Well, it all comes from taxes in the end, doesn't it?
Exactly.
One more thing to say about the Coronavirus Act, and this is really important. It's a terrible piece of law. Every single prosecution, every single criminal prosecution was overturned that was brought about under the Coronavirus Act. As of May 2021, the CPS found that not a single case of a potentially infectious person refusing to comply with the lawful instruction had been prosecuted, so all 270 charges under that legislation were dropped.
Amazing.
We've never had a piece of legislation that's so faulty.
No. I also remember the day when loads of people were handed tickets by the police, but they were all trying to drive to Cornwall. Do you remember that? They were all stopped. They stopped loads of people on the M5 and made them all turn back and issued them all with fines, and not one of them had to pay one.
It wasn't against the law, it was against guidance.
Yeah, they couldn't prove that it was they'd broken any law. They couldn't work out what law they'd broken. And as you were saying, it's very confusing, isn't it now?
Yeah, and like with so many things, it was the poorest and the most disadvantaged who suffered under that. The very first case of a criminal conviction, Marie Dinu, big surprise, she was black, and she found herself in a police cell. She wasn't given the right representation, and she was given a criminal conviction. That was the very first case under the Coronavirus Act, and it was overturned, as they all were.
Right. So where are we exactly? Once this is renewed, are we in the same place as we were yesterday once it's renewed, or are we in a different place?
Well, some of the schedules will be dropped. The most pernicious ones will be gone, and it should have a sunset clause of March 2022.
Right.
I had a sleepless night over this when it was drafted last spring, but the nightmare should hopefully be over by spring 2022.
Well, because there are still those out there who will say this is all just being prepared for something terrible. I mean, I'm not one of them. I don't think that, the government is going to do anything awful and ghastly and terrible like they did in Australia. But I'm sure people in Australia didn't think they were going to do that either. Do you know what I mean? I just don't see it happening. But I still agree with you. This act should not be passed. It should be chucked out immediately.
Well, let's just see how toothless or bold our MPs are today.
Yes.
Let's see what debates come out of today. Hopefully some really decent, meaty ones about the Public Health Act.
Right.
I think that's the best to hope for
Yes.
today.
And as we approach half term, there's more voices than ever now saying, stop testing our children.
Yes. Now, back when mass testing in schools was proposed, you had incredible public health expert Dr. Alison Pollock saying don't do it. You had evidence-based medicine Dr. Carl Hennihan saying don't do it. They were both right. So many of the people that warned that this would be problematic were right, and all of the problems have come to pass. So as of the summer holidays, an average of, I think children had lost 107 days of school.
Yes.
Out of 190 in a
Something
school
like that.
year.
Yeah.
That equated to 1 billion days missed up until the school holidays. Now, as of now, children shouldn't be missing school unless they've had a positive PCR test and they're symptomatic. But schools are still doing this asymptomatic testing. How do I know? I've got boxes of the things at home, just chucking them at us twice a week.
Yeah.
They're still
You're paying
telling
for those as well, by the way.
Well, we are through our taxes, and I guess they're all sitting around and they want to do something with them. I don't. But it's not the advice. They're not supposed to be doing asymptomatic testing. So there was a report in the Telegraph. The Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health has urged that COVID testing in schools stops because of the disruption to education and to children's health. There was an Ofsted report that showed that little children have really gone backwards developmentally, gone back into nappies. Reading and writing standards have slipped. We know educational standards have slipped with GCSEs and
Well,
A-levels.
nobody's taken an exam for 2 years, probably. Have they?
No one's been taking exams. I mean, they've done their best. I had a child who did GCSEs through all of that. But also depression, anxiety, self-harm and eating disorders have gone up. We have to stop mass asymptomatic testing of children. The other thing is...
But again, will the government turn around and say, well, it's only guidance, so it's up to the schools to stop? Because the schools, of course, don't have to do it either.
Yeah, but the government creates this in the first place with the fear-mongering and the propaganda and the primary legislation and the advice. And then schools and local authorities keep going because by that time it's acquired a life of its own and people are nervous.
Yeah.
They're nervous, there's teachers who are frightened about themselves, there's parents who are frightened, and it's acquired a life of its own. And I think it just has to stop now.
It does.
It's so damaging.
And surely half term is the ideal point at which you just say, right, I'll tell you what, let's just stop now. As I think I said to you, my kids' school, they were supposed to be reviewing it at the end of September. Well, I haven't heard anything.
Well, not just your school, the whole country.
Yeah.
There was supposed to be a review of mass testing in schools by the end of September. Well, we haven't had it. And there's a theme here, Mike. We haven't had the costing for how we hit net zero. We haven't had the review of mass testing in schools. We've never had a cost-benefit analysis of lockdown. We haven't had a scientific justification presented for vaccine passports. This keeps happening over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And actually, it's the government that needs to go back to school and sit in detention until they've produced all of this evidence they keep promising us.
And all of this fear-mongering they're doing now, which is, we must take precautions in order to make sure we don't have to lock down and we don't have to shut businesses and businesses don't have to close. Well, they don't have to close, period. The only reason they closed before was because the government made them. Simple, right?
Yeah. I mean, we really have a government here which is characterised by an obstinate avoidance of producing evidence when it goes against their legislation and the direction they want to take. And it's just not acceptable.
No, and I think that's where the parliamentarians need to stand up and say so. Let's hope some of them do.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time again, I'm afraid.
No, I could keep going.
I know.
Shall I see you next week?
I know. Look, why don't you come back next week?
Okay.
And let's talk about Bitcoin next week because
Or
that's
rather,
something that I don't even understand.
central bank digital currencies. Everybody go and look up the video by Rishi Sunak on central bank digital currencies and let me tell you a little bit more about it next week.
Okay. Well, we'll give you some homework of your own. So you go home and do all that and we will see you then.